Hey folks, and welcome to the Grad School Sucks podcast, the show for academics and PhDs and grad students who want to take their career from the ivory tower into industry. I am your host, Dr. Matt Carlson, and today is the last episode of the Grad School Sucks podcast. I've been doing this podcast for almost 2 years, and I've been making content under the name Grad School Sucks for, I think, approaching 5 years at this point, and I've decided about a month ago that it was time to end making content and move on into a different phase of my life. If you want to hear a little bit more about my decision to end the podcast and stop making content, particularly on Instagram, you can check out the episode a few weeks ago that I believe is titled The End of Grad School Sucks, as well as the episode last week where I had my friend Ashley Ruba, a PhD coach, interview me, and I chat a little bit there about my decision to move on. For the last episode today, I wanted to answer your questions. So I got some questions from Instagram and from email listeners, and I will be going through those today and answering them as best I can. I do want to say before I get started that I've really appreciated having the privilege of an audience of people to engage with and to make content for. It has been a lot of fun. I have learned a lot on the way that I probably never would have otherwise learned. Things about storytelling or how to capture attention or how to engage with an audience and find ways to produce value for them. So I do want to say that I'm very grateful for the modest amount of success that I've found along the way, and thank you for being here on the ride. And another thing before we get started is if you have just found the podcast and you're interested in more about how to take your career from academia to industry, I highly encourage you to dig through the previous episodes of this podcast. I've interviewed people across fields, including from the humanities, social sciences, and the hard sciences. And I've interviewed people who've ended up in a variety of different roles and different types of companies, everything from marketing to healthcare and everything in between. So I think you'll probably find at least a few episodes in the past that align with what you are wanting to do with your career and what makes sense for you. But without further ado, let's jump to these questions. All right, so here we go. I do want to say at the forefront that I'm probably not going to answer every one of these questions. Some of them are repeated questions. Some of them are questions that are fairly irrelevant to the topics that I've covered on this show. But the first question that we've got for today are, for current PhD students, what are your thoughts on doing industry internships? I did not do an industry internship. I was a clinical student. I was both clinical and research. And so I did do an internship, but it was working for a clinical company, a small clinical company in Georgia that was working primarily with families that were billing Medicaid. And so I provided clinical services there. I do think that helped me gain more skills in the therapeutic world, as well as an understanding of the whole Medicaid system and the process of handling Medicaid insurance, which actually I use in my job today. But that's besides the point. I think industry internships are one of the best things that you can do for yourself during your PhD. I have talked with many people who've had industry internships, and it turns out that the vast majority of them are very prepared and have a much easier time transitioning to industry than people otherwise would have. And I think that's for a variety of reasons. Number one, you get direct exposure to industry. You get to list it on your resume. You make connections in industry, so you get to start forming a network. Number three, you have exposure to the tools that are used in industry. Many times it's not the same tools used in academia or not used in the same way. And then also number four, I find that many companies, when they offer internships, are kind of doing a screening process to see who would be great candidates to hire right out of either undergrad or grad school. And so several people that I've talked with who've had industry internships ended up getting employed by that same employer, either through the rest of their PhD in some kind of part-time way or whenever they finished their graduate program. So I think if you can, and if it fits into your graduate school experience, I would strongly recommend you looking into industry internships. And some of these things are going to be places where you'll see calls for industry interns. You'll probably see that on LinkedIn. Definitely recommend jumping on LinkedIn if you haven't done so already. And another way to do it is to reach out to other people who have made their way to industry and see if they know of any openings that would be good for interns. So if you can get your foot in the door with an industry internship, I highly recommend it. All right, next question. Are the data analysis boot camps worth doing? I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of variety in the kinds of boot camps that are out there in industry. I've talked with people who've spent about $10,000 to do an industry boot camp with some big company that puts on boot camps, and they still find themselves unemployed at the end of their boot camp. I've talked with other people who've spent a similar amount of money doing a similar kind of boot camp, and they were able to transition into a job very quickly. One notable example of someone who had a boot camp work really well for him was Zeb Larson. He got his PhD in history, figured out that the academic job market was not very strong, and decided that he wanted to do something different. So he joined a boot camp where he learned software development. He paid a good amount of money for it, but that set him up to have a career pretty much right out of the boot camp, and he's growing and growing in his career in software development today. I interviewed him for the podcast a couple months ago, so you can search through to find Zeb Larson if you want to hear more about his story. So I think boot camps are hit or miss, like most other things. You have to make sure that you are doing a boot camp that is aligned with a career that makes sense for you, one that is going to have some kind of linearity whenever you look at the work that you've done in grad school to some degree, as well as a boot camp that's from someone reputable who's worked with people like you and helped them achieve whatever goal they had, which should be a similar goal to what you have. So yes, I do think boot camps can be helpful. They can be incredibly expensive, but there are many more affordable options. And if you want something that's most affordable, I would consider doing online courses like something on Coursera or LinkedIn Learning. That's how I upskilled to take my career from being a research scientist in the social sciences to a data analyst in the healthcare industry today. I think online courses are a great happy medium in between just trying to do everything by yourself and learning from books and YouTube videos to actually have people hands-on in a boot camp, which will end up costing you a lot of money. So I think online courses are a great way to go. And if you can find a boot camp that's affordable, or even if it's not affordable, but it gets you exactly where you want to go, I think it could be great in the long run. All right, next question. There were a couple people in here who basically didn't ask a question and said, thanks for all the awesome content throughout the years. Wish you the best. I really appreciate it. I appreciate that you all paid attention to my journey and that I was able to share something that you found valuable. So thank you for saying that. But I'm not going to jump through all of those. The next one is, how are you feeling about this? And by this, I assume they mean ending grad school sucks and no longer making content. Again, I talked about this a couple weeks ago in another solo episode, as well as last week in my episode with Ashley Ruba. But I think that being a content creator has been a really powerful experience for me. It helped me find community when I left academia and didn't really know what I was doing with my life. It's helped me make connections with a lot of great people, many of whom I've had on the podcast. And it's really gotten me an opportunity to flex that creativity muscle that I think I used a lot during grad school and I missed using. And I think maybe if there were some things that were different in my life, like maybe I didn't have kids or I didn't love my job and I wanted to kind of go hard on turning Grad School Sucks into a full-fledged business, then maybe I would have stuck with it longer. But I think for where I'm at in my life, I've said what I wanted to say here. I've given what I've wanted to give, and I think it's time to wrap it up. Uh, Making all this content and doing courses and podcasts has cost me a fair amount of time and energy that could have been put into other things, as well as money. And I think while I'm sad about ending things, I'm excited about where all that time and energy and money is going to go into something else, more specifically like career stuff, family stuff, and then some other creative projects that are not at all related to grad school or finding a career after grad school. All right, next question. Did you ever feel stuck while writing your dissertation? If so, how did you get through it? Great question. The dissertation is the final mountain of a PhD program, and I encountered some difficulties in my dissertation. I had created a very prestigious data collection project that I wanted to do, working with local nonprofits in the space of research that I was working in. And I'd gotten some money to do this project and ramped up all this data collection effort. And turned out we were just not hitting the numbers that we needed to hit for me to graduate in a timely manner. Our sample size just wasn't going to be big enough. And so about halfway through my dissertation, I had to scrap that and redo my idea for data collection using an existing sample that we had and following up with them. And it was a lot of work. And I think a couple things stand out to me as tips and tricks and fuel for how I did finish the dissertation. So I would say, number one, when I realized that things weren't working, I pulled the plug. And I could have kept collecting data for another 6 months or another year or two in order to focus on that project. But one, I didn't want to. I wanted to kind of get out, even though I did have grand aspirations for whatever my dissertation was going to do. But two, I had the pressure of my wife was pregnant. We were going to have a baby. I needed to move on and get an adult job with a hopefully middle-class salary. And so I had a lot of pressure on me to make things practical. And so I made things practical. And so I think making those practical changes, obviously your mentor has to be okay with it, but being less idealistic, more practical, you can always make the impact that you want to later, whether that's in academia or in industry. You just got to finish that dissertation, get your PhD, and move on to the next thing. The other thing I will say that helped me a lot was having a lot of dedicated writing time. Typically, when I was writing my dissertation, I wasn't collecting data or analyzing. When I was actually doing the writing, I would write for at least 2 hours, if not 3 or 4 hours a day. And by doing that, I was able to churn out somewhere between like 2 or 3 pages, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, typically of rough draft material. And so I was able to add day after day to my dissertation instead of just trying to spend like all day Saturday or like all day Friday working on it. I chipped away a couple hours each day, which still left room for all the other things that I had to do, the internship, the clinical work that I was doing, as well as regular life stuff. And I think getting out of my regular writing space was helpful. I went to coffee shops. I had 3 or 4 that I liked, and so I would go to one and grind away for an hour or two until I felt like I kind of lost energy. And then oftentimes I would just go to another one, get a new coffee drink, whatever it was, sit down, write for another hour or two until I was honestly so exhausted that I couldn't write anymore. And usually that was around lunchtime or a little bit after. And then I would kind of go home, do clinical stuff, do whatever else I needed to do. And so I think actually putting your butt in the seat and trying to clear out as many distractions as you can and just putting words on paper. Because I think the longer you avoid working on your dissertation, waiting for you to get the perfect idea, waiting for you to have the perfect inspiration or feel like writing, it's just going to take forever. All right, moving on to our next question. First year neuro PhD student, how do I start prepping for industry jobs since day one? So I'm going to speak to just everyone generally, not just neuro folks, but if you are just starting a graduate program, one of the best things that you can do for yourself is to form a network. Starting to form a network early on can make the path much easier later, both from like a perspective taking and information gathering perspective, as well as actually having a network that can help you find available jobs and potentially be referrals for those jobs. I highly recommend that you jump on LinkedIn. Go ahead and create a LinkedIn profile if you haven't already, even if you're just early on in grad school or you're a late stage undergrad thinking about grad school, and find people who have gone through the path that you have. So if you have a PhD in neuroscience, get on LinkedIn and in the search bar put PhD in neuroscience, put it in quotes, search for it, and click the people tab in order to see a lot of people who have gotten a PhD in neuroscience or who are currently getting a PhD in neuroscience. And what that does for you is it instantly opens up all of this information about other people. You may have to pay for LinkedIn Premium to see a lot of the information, but at about $50 a month, I think you'll get a lot of benefit out of that $50 a month, because it'll show you the different kinds of jobs that people from your field get. And then you can start poking around to see what are the potential pathways for you to go in the future. And then if you see one you like, you can start hitting people up who've taken that path and build your network that way. Also, be looking out for industry internships. That's a big, big thing. Next question, how do you deal with burnout? So I don't get burnt out that much anymore because I'm working a regular 9-to-5 job with good pay and good work-life balance. And I'm not doing clinical work anymore. I'm not in grad school anymore. I'm not in academia anymore. And those were my main sources of burnout. I would say that in the past, when I've run into burnout, it's been from either my clinical work or working in academia or a mixture of both. And I think the things that I did to address burnout well were the consistent things: going to therapy, exercising, sleeping as well as I can. At one point in my graduate program, I decided to go on SSRIs, which are like a mood stabilizer medication. And that really helped me during the time when I struggled during grad school with the pressure of everything that I had to do. And I think the way people deal with burnout can differ from person to person, but I think addressing the foundation: are you getting enough sleep? Are you doing something that you love? Do you have people in your life who are helping you along the way? That can be really beneficial, but there's also the peaks of burnout that happen whenever there's times of particularly high stress. And so honestly, like seeking help during those times, I can't say enough about going to therapy. I've been in and out of therapy for probably a decade at this point, and that has definitely helped me gain perspective and understand how I get burned out, how to predict the things that are going to get me burned out, and how to avoid those things in the future. And if you need to, you can always take a leave of absence. Again, that's something that I think you should talk about your mentor with, as well as a clinician who can help you make the decision on whether or not you need to step away from things entirely. But I think putting your mental health first is something that I did not prioritize in grad school, even though I was a mental health clinician, and something that I definitely prioritize more today. Next question, is entering industry a feasible option for PhDs of all fields, i.e. humanities, social sciences? Yes, it is. That is the purpose of the podcast, is to show you pathways that you can take. We already talked about Zeb Larson, but there are some other folks in the past who come from humanities that I've interviewed, including Joe Stubenrauch. You can go look back at his episode. I do think the difficulty of making that transition differs, or the amount of upskilling or the amount of positioning you need to do can differ. A lot of folks from the hard sciences tend to transition to industry a little bit more smoothly, because a lot of the positions in hard sciences are just kind of like the scientist roles that you often find in academia, although the context may be a little bit different. Social sciences is somewhere in between. A lot of social sciences go on to be UX researchers, data analysts, that kind of a thing. But there is a little bit of a transition period. And I think the humanities do have it the hardest. I tend to hear that pretty consistently. But there are many examples of people who have done it. It may be a longer road. It may be a little bit more difficult. You may have to do more upskilling and more networking. But of course, it is something that's feasible. There are examples all around you of people people who have done it. And if you doubt that, go on LinkedIn, search your degree in quotes, and start looking around at people's profiles. Next question, when moving to industry, are you losing the freedom that academia gives? So I'm not sure exactly what you mean by the freedom. I think there are mainly two kinds of freedom that people talk about in academia. One is the freedom to study what you want, and the other is the freedom to set your own schedule. I think, and I'll address them in reverse, I think the freedom to set your own schedule is way overhyped in academia. Yes, my day is more structured by other people in my 9 to 5 job in industry now, but there are far fewer things that I'm trying to fit into my day than when I was in academia. And a joke I often hear that professors say is academia is great because you get to pick which, 7 days a week you work or which 60 or 70 hours a week you work. You work a lot, and getting to set your schedule of when you work is nice and can have benefits. But the truth is that work-life balance outside of academia and industry is better, and studies have shown this. Nature does a study every couple of years, and they consistently show that PhDs in industry report better work-life balance than PhDs in academia. So I think that freedom is actually a false positive. I don't think that freedom is that good. The intellectual freedom I think can be different. There are people who say they have as much intellectual freedom outside academia as they do inside. I think those positions might be a little more rare, but I think there is an aspect of intellectual freedom that you lose when you leave academia. That being said, many people in academia don't have intellectual freedom. They're studying the things that grants will fund. They're studying whatever their professor has studied. Maybe they're working on different initiatives as a research scientist that they didn't set up, they didn't start, they don't have agency over. They're just doing the work of science and trying to fit in their intellectual freedom where they can. And that's actually pretty akin to most industry jobs. You do the work required of you and then you fit in the intellectual freedom where you can. But yeah, I do think academia does provide some people with more intellectual freedom than they will find outside of academia. And that's a cost-benefit analysis that you are going to have to make on your own. Is the intellectual freedom that you get in academia worth giving up in order to get better pay and work-life balance, and potentially even finding that intellectual freedom in a special kind of industry job? Next question, can going industry make it too late to go back to academia later on in life? Thank you in advance. I think for many people, going industry is probably the end of their time in academia. I think for the majority of them, that's because they don't want to go back to academia. They've seen the money, they've seen the work-life balance, and they just don't believe that going back would be worth it, even if they could find a dream job in academia. But yeah, I do think it might make it a little more difficult to go back. Typically, the people that I see go back to academia are those who had maybe a decade or two of success in industry. They've developed some kind of expertise, and they want to take that to academia and play the role of a professor and give away a little more intellectually than they did in industry. So yes, I do think it can make it a little more difficult to go back, but definitely not impossible. We see examples of people who go back, but I think most people don't go back because they don't want to go back, not because they can't. Do you currently have depression? That is the next question. That's a weird question. No, I do not currently have depression. I did struggle with depression and anxiety in grad school and when I was a research scientist, and maybe a little bit afterwards, but therapy and antidepressants did a lot of good work for me, as well as changing the context of my life, going from a pressure cooker in academia into a much more chill, laid-back experience in industry has done wonders for me. Also, I would say I'm probably more consistent at exercise and trying to get better sleep, and all of those things affect your body and your mind, as well as eating better. So no, I would say maybe I'm bummed, or I was bummed when I first decided to end grad school sucks, but no, I do not currently have depression. Next question, when do you suggest people move to a new job or from academia versus keep pushing through? So I would say those are two different questions. I would make the jump from academia whenever you feel like you're ready and you know you want whatever's on the other side. There are some people who I've interviewed who have left their PhD program or decided to master out and go straight to industry, and they've loved the transition. And they talk a little bit about maybe one day they would go back and finish their PhD if they wanted to. But I think if you have the connections and you have the upskilling and you have all the things that you need to do to make that transition, why not go ahead and make that transition whenever you're ready? whether that's before or after you get your PhD. In terms of getting a new job, if you're in industry, there are some general rules, not really rules, but guidelines that people look for getting a new job. Typically, they want to see you in a role at least 6 to 12 months, or preferably like 2 years before moving to another role. During a particularly hot job market, a lot of people will job hop in order to increase their salary, so they'll move every 3 to 6 months to a different role. That is a great way to push your salary up higher and higher. But I think that for many of the bigger employers who are seen as more of like the place to be, they want to see that you've been in a role for at least a couple years in order to know that they're going to get their money's worth out of you whenever they hire you. Because actually, most companies lose money on new employees whenever they hire them until they bring them up to speed and they produce more value than they're getting paid. And that can often take 3 to 6 months. So I think when I think about a new job, I think like 1 to 2 years. And then if you get a promotion, you could push that back a little bit more. I think once you start looking at 5, 6, 7 years and you haven't been promoted, you can start to look a little bit stale on your resume. And the question may come up for recruiters like, why hasn't this person gotten a promotion or taken on a new position or new challenge? So those are the things I think about whenever I'm thinking about a new job. Next question. What is the one thing you wish you could tell your past self when quitting academia? My past self when I was quitting academia. When I decided to leave academia, I felt really bad about myself. I felt like I was a failure and that I had let down, my colleagues and the academic mentors that I had along the way. And I think the thing I would have told my past self is that nobody cares. And I mean that in a good way. Like, everyone is worried about their own career. They're worried about their own bills they have to pay. They're worried about their own family struggles. Nobody is demoralized or nobody's life is ruined when you make the decision to do something else with your career. And there will probably be people out there who may tell you that what you're doing is wrong or what you're doing is ruining things for other people. And I think that is often dysfunctional leadership in academia. I'm glad I never experienced anything like that. But I think being okay with failure, as long as you're falling forward and you're falling into the next thing and you're continuing to improve over time, I think quitting is okay. I think if I would have told myself quitting is okay, I probably would have moved on emotionally faster instead of dwelling on the fact that I was another failed PhD or whatever negative thing I was telling to myself at the time. All right, last question that I'm going to address today, and I think this is a really apt question to end this episode and the podcast on. How do you get over the sad feeling that grad school is over? I did feel really sad when grad school ended. I was happy to have my dissertation done. I was happy to be done with classes, but I made a lot of good friends along the way, and saying goodbye to many of them was difficult for me because they became my kinship, they became my family, and a lot of them I still talk to this day, but I don't get to see in person anymore, and that does make me sad. And I was really sad at the end of grad school, even though I was also very relieved that it was over. A couple things come to mind when thinking about like that period of time in my life and how I moved to the next thing. I think having something to move into was helpful for me, and so that was my role as a research scientist, having something to some work to do, some new people to meet, a new world to learn. I think that was helpful in terms of keeping my mind active and my energy focused on something instead of just sitting and dwelling. So I think having a new thing, probably like a new career, or if you aren't starting a career or you don't need to start a career, having some kind of hobby that you're interested in. But I think the other thing is actually like letting the sadness sit with you, because the sadness is there because you're giving up something that was meaningful, probably more the community piece, but the act of learning is also a great thing. And so leaving a place in your life where you get to learn all the time and moving on to something else can be kind of sad. But from my clinical experience, I mean, I'm not a therapist anymore, but learning to accept negative or difficult feelings and embrace them and uh, actually have the experience that they're trying to give you instead of trying to avoid them can be a really great thing. And I think journaling is something that's helped me a lot in the past and something that I do every now and then. It allows me to get my feelings out a little bit, and then having people to talk to, like my friends around, can be great. And then also seeing a therapist if the sadness is getting in the way of you moving forward in life. And I think another part of it is like learning that just because you're moving on from something good doesn't mean that you'll never find something like it again. You may never find something exactly like grad school again, and I don't expect that I will at all. But there are other great things in the future that you will find again, whether it's a great social group or a career that you love or a loved one. There are a lot of great things ahead of us, and grad school may have been a peak in some ways, a peak experience in some ways, but at the same time, there are a lot of great experiences down the road. And I think if you can feel the sadness and decide to move forward into the next thing, I think that's a great place to be. If you move forward without feeling sad, I think you carry it with you. If you just feel sad and you don't move forward, then that also has some negative stuff as well. But choosing to feel the sad emotion, appreciate the good times that you've had, the privilege that it was to go to grad school, even if it was difficult, even if you experienced some negative things, not discounting those, of course, but appreciating the good times you've had and being open to having good times again in the future is a great orientation to have. All right, folks, that is the end of the questions. That is the end of this episode, and this is the end of the podcast. I want to thank you very much for coming along for the ride. I want to thank you for the interaction over the years. I want to thank you for the give and take of making content and hearing from you and continuing to refine the process as I went. I really feel privileged to have been able to speak to so many people and to be able to interact with many people who are on their journey through and out of academia. And I wish you the best along the way. I encourage you to dig back into the podcast for other episodes. There are probably episodes that are parallel with your journey that you could learn something from. And I also encourage you to check out the website, gradschoolsucks.com. I will at some point this summer be converting my current website into a standalone one-pager that has a lot of different resources you can access. So it's not something that I've got set up right now, but at some point this summer it'll be converted. So if you're listening to this in the future, check out gradschoolsucks.com for other resources on your journey through grad school and into industry. That's it for today. Thank you all so much for listening and being here, and I'll see you all next time.